The weight of it surprised her most. Not the physical weight, though the crown was heavier than she expected, but the weight of responsibility, of duty, of knowing that thousands of lives depended on every decision she made. She had closed her eyes during a regression session, expecting to find herself as a peasant or maybe a merchant, but when she opened them in that other time, she was sitting on a throne, wearing velvet and gold, and people were bowing before her, calling her Your Majesty. She had been royalty. She had ruled. She had worn the crown. Her name was Jessica, and she had always been fascinated by medieval history. Castles and kings and queens captured her imagination in a way that other time periods didn't. She would spend hours watching documentaries about European royalty, reading historical novels, visiting castle ruins whenever she traveled. Her friends teased her about it, called it her obsession, but Jessica felt it was more than just interest. It was recognition. Like some part of her remembered what it was like to live in those times, in those places, with that kind of power and responsibility. The feeling grew stronger as she got older. By her early 30s, Jessica couldn't walk into a cathedral or a historic building without feeling overwhelmed by emotion. She would stand in the great halls of old castles and feel tears streaming down her face for reasons she couldn't explain. She would see portraits of noble women from centuries past and feel like she was looking at people she once knew. It was more than historical interest. It was personal. Things came to a head when Jessica visited a castle in France on vacation. It was a beautifully preserved medieval fortress that had once belonged to a powerful duchess. Jessica joined a tour group, listening as the guide described the history, the political intrigues, the daily life of the nobility who had lived there. But when they entered the main throne room, Jessica's vision went blurry, her chest tightened. She couldn't breathe. She stumbled out of the room, found a quiet corner, and sat down trying to calm herself. But the emotions kept coming. Grief, fear, anger, loss, all of it washing over her in waves. She felt like she was remembering something terrible that had happened in that room. But she had never been to this castle before. She had no reason to feel this way. Yet the emotions were undeniable and overwhelming. That experience convinced Jessica she needed to explore what was happening. A friend suggested past life regression, saying it might help her understand these intense reactions to historical places and periods. Jessica had been skeptical of past lives before, but she couldn't deny that something was going on that conventional explanations didn't address. So she found a therapist who specialized in regression work, a man named Dr. Gregory who had been practicing for over 20 years. Dr. Gregory's office was lined with books about history, consciousness, and spirituality. They spent their first session just talking, with Jessica describing her fascination with medieval times, her emotional reactions to castles and historical sites, and particularly the overwhelming experience in France. Dr. Gregory listened thoughtfully and said that sometimes people carried very strong connections to specific historical periods because they had actually lived during those times. He suggested they do a regression to see if Jessica could access any past life memories related to her interest in royalty and castles. Jessica agreed, both nervous and excited. Part of her was afraid of what she might discover, but another part desperately wanted answers to feelings she had carried her whole life. They scheduled a full regression session for the following week. In the days leading up to it, Jessica found herself dreaming about castles every night. Stone corridors, grand halls, heavy wooden doors, all of it vivid and detailed in ways her conscious mind couldn't have invented. The day of the session arrived. Jessica settled into the comfortable recliner in Dr. Gregory's office, surrounded by soft lighting and gentle instrumental music. Dr. Gregory explained the process again, reassuring her that she would be safe, that she would maintain awareness, that she could return to present consciousness at any time if she felt uncomfortable. Then he began the induction. His voice was steady and calming as he guided her to close her eyes, to focus on her breathing, to allow her body to relax completely. He used progressive relaxation, having her release tension from each part of her body, from her toes up through her legs, her torso, her arms, her shoulders, her neck, her face. Jessica felt herself sinking deeper and deeper into the chair, her awareness becoming fluid and expansive. Dr. Gregory counted her down from 10 to 1, each number taking her deeper into trance. He suggested that when she reached 1, she would find herself in the lifetime that was connected to her fascination with castles and royalty, the lifetime that would help her understand her current experiences. Jessica felt herself moving backward through time, through layers of memory and consciousness, searching for the source of that deep recognition she had always felt. When Dr. Gregory reached one and asked her to notice where she was, Jessica found herself standing in a stone corridor. The walls were made of massive gray blocks fitted together with precision. Torches burned in iron sconces, casting flickering light and deep shadows. The air was cool and smelled of stone and wood smoke and something cooking, probably meat roasting somewhere in the castle kitchens. She could hear distant sounds, voices, and footsteps echoing through the vast structure. Dr. Gregory asked her to look at herself, to notice what she was wearing, what her body felt like. Jessica looked down and saw she was dressed in a heavy gown made of deep blue velvet with gold embroidery along the hem and neckline. The fabric was rich and expensive, the kind only nobility could afford. Her hands were smaller and more delicate than her current hands, with rings on several fingers, including a large ruby that caught the torchlight. She touched her head and felt an elaborate headdress, heavy with jewels and fabric. Dr. Gregory asked her name. Jessica felt for it, and the answer came clearly. "Isabella," she said. "I am Isabella." He asked what year it was, where she was. The information flowed without effort. It was 1347, and she was in her castle, in what would now be called Central France. She was the Duchess of this territory, a title she had inherited from her father who had died 2 years earlier, leaving her as the sole ruler of these lands. Dr. Gregory asked Isabella to describe her daily life, what it was like to be a duchess in medieval France. Isabella moved through the stone corridors of her castle, and Jessica experienced it as if she were actually there. She went to the great hall where her advisors were waiting for the morning council meeting. These were men, all of them, because women in positions of power were rare and often challenged. They stood as she entered, bowed respectfully, but she could see in some of their faces a resentment that a woman held the authority they believed should belong to a man. She sat in her chair at the head of the long table, not quite a throne but elevated above the others to show her position. Her steward began the meeting, presenting matters that required her attention and decision. There was a dispute between 2 villages about water rights. There was a request from the church for funds to repair the cathedral. There were reports of bandits on the eastern roads who needed to be dealt with. There was news of political maneuvering in the royal court, alliances shifting, marriages being arranged, power plays that could affect her territory. Isabella listened to each matter carefully, asked questions, weighed the options, made decisions. This was her role, her responsibility. Every choice she made affected the lives of thousands of people who depended on her for protection, justice, and stability. It was overwhelming, the weight of that responsibility, but she had been trained for this since childhood. Her father had prepared her, knowing that his lack of a son meant his daughter would have to rule. He had taught her politics, strategy, economics, diplomacy, everything she would need to hold power in a world that didn't think women should have it. Dr. Gregory asked Isabella to move to a significant moment in that lifetime, something important that shaped who she was. The scene shifted, and Isabella found herself in a private chamber, talking with a man she recognized as her betrothed. His name was Henry, and he was a count from a neighboring territory. Their marriage had been arranged by their families when they were children. A political alliance meant to strengthen both their positions. They had met several times over the years as the marriage date approached, and Isabella had grown fond of him. He was intelligent, respectful, shared her love of learning and books. But now, just months before their wedding, Henry was telling her he couldn't marry her. He looked anguished, pacing the room, explaining that his family was withdrawing from the arrangement. They had found a more advantageous match, an alliance with a more powerful duke that would benefit their territory more than marrying Isabella would. It wasn't personal, he said. It was politics. It was always politics. Isabella felt the blow of this rejection, not just emotionally but politically. Her power was already questioned because she was a woman. Being rejected by her betrothed would make her look weak, vulnerable, less desirable as an ally. Other nobles would see it as an opportunity to challenge her authority or to refuse their own commitments to her. The marriage had been a cornerstone of her political strategy, and now it was crumbling. She wanted to weep, wanted to rage, wanted to let Henry see how much this hurt, but she couldn't. She was a duchess before she was a woman. She couldn't show weakness, couldn't let anyone see her as anything less than completely in control. So she held herself with dignity, thanked Henry coldly for his honesty, and dismissed him from her presence. Only after he left did she allow herself to cry, sitting alone in her chamber, feeling the loneliness of her position close in around her. Dr. Gregory asked what happened after this, how Isabella handled the situation. The scene moved forward, showing Jessica the next chapter of Isabella's life. The broken engagement had indeed damaged her political standing. Several nobles who had been allied with her began to distance themselves, seeking better connections elsewhere. Rumors spread that she was unmarriageable, that something must be wrong with her if Henry had rejected her. The church questioned whether a woman could effectively rule without a husband to guide her. But Isabella refused to collapse under these attacks. She doubled down on her governance, focused on making her territory prosperous and secure. She personally oversaw the improvement of roads and bridges, making trade easier and attracting merchants. She negotiated fair taxes that didn't crush the peasants but still funded necessary improvements and defense. She established a reputation for wise judgment, settling disputes in ways that satisfied both parties. She built alliances not through marriage but through mutual benefit and respect. Slowly, grudgingly, even those who had doubted her began to acknowledge her effectiveness. Her territory was better managed than most. Her people were relatively content. She maintained peace and order. She was, despite being a woman, a good ruler, and that success became its own kind of power, making it harder for others to challenge her legitimacy. But the loneliness never went away. Isabella lived her life in a strange isolation, surrounded by people but truly close to none of them. She couldn't trust most of her advisors, who would have preferred a male duke. She couldn't confide in other noblewomen, who were jealous or critical of her unmarried status and political power. She had servants but not friends, advisors but not confidants. The crown she wore, metaphorically if not literally, was beautiful and valuable but also isolated her in ways that were sometimes unbearable. Dr. Gregory asked Isabella to show him her greatest triumph in that lifetime. The scene shifted again, and Isabella was in her great hall, but it was transformed for a celebration. Musicians played, people danced, tables were laden with food and wine. This was a feast to celebrate a major diplomatic victory. Isabella had negotiated a complex alliance between three territories that had been enemies for generations. Through patient diplomacy, careful negotiation, and genuine respect for all parties, she had created a peace that would benefit everyone involved. The achievement was significant not just politically but personally. She had done what many men had failed to do. She had proven that her power came not from masculine force but from wisdom, patience, and genuine care for the well-being of all her people. In this moment, surrounded by celebration, she felt vindicated. She had taken the role she inherited not by choice but by birth, and she had made something meaningful of it. She had ruled well. She had served her people faithfully. She had earned respect, not despite being a woman but by being an effective leader regardless of gender. But Dr. Gregory also asked Isabella to show her greatest challenge, the moment that tested her most deeply. The scene shifted to something darker. There was conflict, war breaking out between neighboring territories. Isabella had tried to remain neutral, to keep her lands safe through diplomacy. But neutrality wasn't always an option when larger powers were fighting. She was forced to choose sides, to commit her soldiers to a battle she didn't believe in, to send men to die for political reasons that seemed increasingly pointless. She stood on the walls of her castle, watching her army march out to join the conflict. She knew many of them wouldn't return. She had met these men, knew some of their families, understood that each life lost would leave behind widows and orphans. The weight of that responsibility crushed her. She was sending people to die because the political reality left her no other choice. This was the darkness at the heart of power, the burden that nobility carried, the reason the crown was so heavy. The battle went poorly. Her forces were on the losing side. Many of her soldiers died. Her territory was weakened. And worse, there were rumors that she had chosen the wrong side, that a better leader would have made a different decision. The criticism stung not just because it was unfair, but because she had her own doubts. Maybe she had chosen wrong. Maybe there was a better path she hadn't seen. Maybe she had failed the people who depended on her. This period of self-doubt and political vulnerability was the lowest point of Isabella's reign, but Dr. Gregory guided Jessica to see how Isabella recovered, how she rebuilt from this failure. Isabella took responsibility publicly for the decision, didn't try to blame advisors or circumstances. She met with the families of the fallen soldiers personally, offered what comfort and compensation she could. She worked tirelessly to restore her territory's prosperity and security. And gradually, through consistent effort and genuine care, She regained the trust she had lost. Dr. Gregory asked Isabella to move forward to the end of that lifetime. Isabella was older now, in her 60s, which was quite old for that time period. She had never married, had ruled alone her entire life. She had no children to inherit her title, which meant her death would trigger a power struggle over who would control her territory. This knowledge weighed on her heavily. All she had built, all she had protected, might be torn apart after she was gone. She lay in her bed in her private chamber, her body failing from an illness that the physicians couldn't cure. Her closest advisors and the few people she considered friends were gathered around her. She gave them final instructions about the succession, urged them to work together to ensure a peaceful transition, made them promise to protect her people. And then, with as much dignity as she had lived her entire life, Isabella let go. Jessica experienced Isabella's death, felt the release of consciousness from that worn-out body, felt the strange relief of no longer carrying the immense weight of responsibility. Isabella's soul separated from her body and moved into a space of light and peace. She looked back at the life she had lived and felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She had ruled well, had served faithfully, had done the best she could with the challenges she faced. But it had been hard, so hard, and lonely in ways that had never fully healed. Dr. Gregory guided Jessica to move into the between-life space, to meet with Isabella's guides and understand the larger meaning of that lifetime. Jessica found herself surrounded by beings of light and love who helped her review Isabella's life with compassion and wisdom. They showed her that Isabella had chosen that lifetime deliberately, had agreed to take on the challenge of ruling as a woman in a time when women rarely held such power. The lessons of that lifetime were about responsibility, about maintaining integrity under pressure, about leading with wisdom rather than force. Isabella had learned to balance strength and compassion, to make difficult decisions with the understanding that every choice had consequences, to carry authority without being corrupted by it. These were lessons her soul needed, qualities she was developing across multiple incarnations. But the guides also showed Jessica that Isabella had carried certain wounds from that lifetime: the loneliness, the constant need to prove herself, the feeling that she could never fully relax or trust anyone. These patterns had imprinted deeply on her soul, and some of these patterns had carried forward into her current life as Jessica. Her difficulty forming deep relationships, her tendency to take on too much responsibility, her feeling that she had to be perfect and strong at all times, these were echoes of Isabella's experiences. The guides explained that part of why Jessica had been drawn to medieval history, to castles and royalty, was because her soul was trying to heal these wounds. By consciously remembering Isabella's life, by understanding the context and challenges, Jessica could release the patterns that no longer served her. She didn't need to carry Isabella's loneliness or burden of perfection anymore. She could honor that past life while choosing differently in this current incarnation. Dr. Gregory brought Jessica back to present consciousness slowly and gently, counting her up from 1 to 10, reminding her of her current body and current time. When Jessica opened her eyes, she was overwhelmed with emotion. She had been Isabella. She had ruled a territory in medieval France. She had worn the crown, made life and death decisions, experienced the profound isolation of power. It explained so much about her current life, about why she felt drawn to that time period, why castles made her cry, why the throne room in France had triggered such intense emotions. In the weeks and months after the regression, Jessica worked on integrating what she had learned. She understood now that her fascination with medieval royalty wasn't just historical interest. It was soul memory, recognition of a life she had actually lived. And more importantly, she began to see how Isabella's patterns were still affecting her. She realized she was still trying to rule her own life the way Isabella had ruled her territory, taking on too much responsibility, never asking for help, maintaining a facade of perfection and control. She started making changes. She practiced being vulnerable with friends, letting them see her struggles instead of always being strong and capable. She learned to delegate at work instead of trying to control every detail herself. She started dating again after years of avoiding relationships, working through her fear of rejection that came from Isabella's broken engagement. She gave herself permission to not have all the answers, to make mistakes, to be human rather than trying to be a perfect leader of her own life. Jessica also developed a new relationship with medieval history. She still loved visiting castles and learning about royalty, but now she approached it with understanding rather than unexplained emotion. When she visited historic sites, she would sometimes feel Isabella's presence, a quiet acknowledgement between past and present selves. She felt compassion for Isabella, for the challenges she had faced and the loneliness she had endured, and she felt gratitude that she was living in a time where women had more freedom, more choices, more opportunity to balance strength with vulnerability. She thought about the crown Isabella had worn, the metaphorical weight of leadership and responsibility, and she realized that in this lifetime, she could choose what crown to wear, if any. She didn't have to carry the burden of an entire territory. She didn't have to prove herself constantly. She could lead in smaller, more personal ways, could use her natural strength and wisdom without sacrificing her ability to connect in trust and love. Years later, Jessica returned to that castle in France where she had first been overwhelmed by emotion. This time, she walked into the throne room with full awareness. She stood in the place where Isabella had once stood, making decisions that affected thousands of lives, and she spoke quietly to that past self across the centuries, thanking her for her service, honoring her courage and wisdom, and telling her that it was okay to rest now. The work was done. The crown had been worn faithfully, and the lessons had been carried forward into a new life where they could be expressed with more freedom and less burden. Subscribe to uncover the royal lives and powerful lessons your soul has been carrying.